I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you updates from across Ukraine, where Russia is pushing forward in Donbas. We analyse the latest news from China, where Ukraine's foreign minister has said that the country is ready for talks with Russia if Moscow is prepared to negotiate in good faith. And we speak to Mathieu Boulegue on his co-authored new research for Chatham House into the state of the Russian military.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 24th of July. 2 years and 156 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by my colleague, assistant comment editor Francis Dearnley. I started by summarising the latest news from Ukraine. Let's start in Donbas, where there is talk of a potentially very dangerous situation for Ukrainian troops west of the village of Ochratinye. Just to caveat all of this with a heavy pinch of salt, that this is a developing situation and that everything that follows is an attempt to understand what may be happening. So what and where are we talking about? Well, you'll remember earlier on this year the surprise Russian advance that punched a hole in the Ukrainian lines at the village of Ochratinye, northwest of Avdiivka. Since then, Russia has been steadily advancing northwards towards the strategic highway that links the town of Pokrovsk in the west and Toretsk, Konstantinivka and Kramatorsk in the east and northeast. According to the map of Deep State, held by researchers to be generally reliable, Russia is close to enacting an encirclement of several Ukrainian battalions north of Progress, a village to the west of Ochratinye. As analyst Rob Lee, senior foreign policy analyst at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, writes, Deep State updated their map this morning, showing further Russian gains on the Pokrovsk front that places battalions from Ukraine's 31st Mechanized Brigade in an increasingly precarious position. Rob has also summarised the most recent developments there, drawing on several sources, as you'll hear. He's written, Deep State say the operational tactical situation on the Pokrovsk front became critical over the weekend after the Ukrainian infantry brigade holding Progress conducted a chaotic retreat. The post suggests they were not trained properly. The 47th Mechanized Brigade responded, but could not hold the town due to a lack of infantry. Now a pocket has been created north of the town, and the 1st and 3rd Battalions from Ukraine's 31st Mechanized Brigade are at risk of an encirclement. But, they say, there is no withdrawal order. Rob also quotes from Ukrainian journalist Yuri Butusov, who he says makes the point that the situation on the Pokrovsk front is critical after Russia advanced 6 kilometres over the past 7 days. He says Russia deliberately focuses its assaults on the most vulnerable brigades with poor command and control. He also notes a lack of coordination of UAVs and EW, that's electronic warfare, which leads to UAV losses from EW fratricide. There is some corroboration here from other journalists that we're seeing. Our friend, freelance journalist Fabrice Després wrote, and I'm quoting from Fabrice here, the loss of Ochratinye 3 months ago has had some really bad consequences for Ukrainian forces, with Russian units moving ever closer to the road linking Pokrovsk to Konstantinivka. It's already under fire, and the crucial logistics hub of Pokrovsk itself. At the Kiev Independent, they've got a comment from a spokesperson of the Kortsia group of forces who told them that Russian forces are attempting to break through Ukrainian defences in Donetsk Oblast towards Pokrovsk and Kurakhove. This is their quote, all Russian attempts to advance are met with fierce resistance. As of this morning, in the Pokrovsk direction, our defenders repelled 41 enemy attacks. Heavy battles continue as Russia seeks to dislodge Ukrainian units with ground assaults and heavy shelling. Russia, this is coming from Lieutenant Colonel Nazar Volishin. Russia threw a lot of forces into the capture of the village of Ochratinye so they can rush the Pokrovsk-Konstantinivka highway. Over the past day, and this is just some more context, over the past day, Russia suffered 329 soldiers killed and wounded and lost 14 units of equipment, including an Su-25 attack aircraft and a tank. This is all from the spokesperson talking to the Kiev Independent. Another tank and 6 artillery pieces were heavily damaged. So, an attempt by us there to summarise and bring together some of the reporting going on in and around Donetsk, and more as we get it. Across Ukraine, Russian attacks over the past day have killed at least 4 people and injured at least 17, including children. One of the attacks hit the office of a humanitarian organisation in Kharkiv. This is according to the regional authorities there. Governor Mathieu Boulegue said on Telegram today at 5 a.m. the Russians hit the office of the Swiss Foundation for Mine Action, that's FSD, with a ballistic missile. An industrial building, 5 cars and a house were damaged. Ihor Tedakov, the local mayor, initially reported that 1 person had been killed, but later said the information could not be confirmed. In Donetsk, 3 people were killed and 3 injured during a Russian attack. That comes from Vadim Filashkin. And down in the south, local officials said, and this is from Reuters, a Russian drone attack damaged port infrastructure and commercial and residential buildings early on Wednesday, wounding 3 people in the Ukrainian city of Izmail on the River Danube. Oleg Kiper, governor of the Odessa region, said in a statement that the attack damaged several buildings in the port, caused a fire, and also damaged 3 trucks. The Air Force said that Ukrainian air defense shot down 17 of 23 drones that were launched from Russian territory and occupied Crimea, and most of the drones were downed over the southern Odessa region. The Southern Military Command put out a statement on Telegram. They said the enemy attacked the southern regions with attack drones. Port infrastructure has been their target again. And Reuters just reminds us that Izmail and other ports of the Danube River are very important routes for Ukraine to import fuel, at a time when, of course, demand for fuel is rising as businesses and residents depend on generators to produce electricity during extended blackouts. Staying in Ukraine, and just a few more updates. There's an update here for us from a story that we reported yesterday. This is on the Ukrainian attack on the large ferry in occupied Crimea. We've got a comment from the Ukrainian military who say that they have, quote, severely damaged the ferry close to Crimea that was being used to transport military equipment to Russian forces on the occupied peninsula. The Ukrainians called the ship, quote, the third and last railway ferry that Russia had in that area, and they posted footage of black smoke rising above a vessel on fire. You'll remember yesterday we only had the Russian sources commenting on this. Now the Ukrainians have added their account. They add some detail. The ferry had been moored in the southern Russian port of Kavkaz in the Krasnodar region, just 7 miles from the 12-mile Kerch Bridge, the only direct land link between Russia and Crimea. Ukraine's general staff said its navy, in coordination with other forces, quote, inflicted significant damage on the enemy cargo ship Slavyanin, which had been used to transport railway carriages, vehicles and containers for military purposes. Let's go to Moscow then, where 2 people, allegedly including a Russian military intelligence officer, were injured, critically injured, in a car blast in the city. This is coming from Russia's Interior Ministry, who made this statement on Wednesday. They said that the blast was caused by the detonation of an unidentified object after a man and a woman got into a parked Toyota Land Cruiser. The victims were hospitalized, and Irina Volk, a ministry spokesman, added that a criminal investigation has been opened. The man, who Russian media reported was on Ukraine's online target list, lost his feet in the explosion, while the woman received shrapnel wounds. The Baza Telegram channel, which is linked to Russian security services, said that one of the victims was a Russian military intelligence officer. Finally, before we go to Francis, you'll remember that in the last few months, Ukraine followed Russia in allowing and encouraging convicts to fight in its armed forces. Well, now we have some numbers. Nearly 4,000 Ukrainian prisoners are fighting on the front line. This comes from Roman Kostenko, who Dom interviewed a few months ago, the Secretary of the Committee on National Security, Defence and Intelligence. He said there are already 3,800 convicts in the armed forces. Most of them have just finished their training. However, several of them have already been wounded or killed. To remind ourselves, under a deal offered to inmates by the government, prisoners will have their remaining sentences cleared, regardless of length, if they agree to serve in the army without leave until the end of the war. Mr. Konstanko added that the army is likely to mobilise another 1,000 convicts. I think that's the end of the military updates, Francis. So, Francis, can you talk us through some of the political and diplomatic developments that you've seen?
Thanks, David. Well, as you say, it's the front lines which should be our focus today. But that's not to say there aren't significant developments too in the international arena. We're getting the first readouts from the meeting in Beijing between Kuleba and his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi, with the former saying that Kyiv is ready for talks with Russia if Moscow was prepared to negotiate in good faith. Though, and this is crucial, he said that Ukraine has seen no sign of that. This is an interesting statement. Let's unpack it. It's a diplomatic way of saying we are willing to talk, but not on the current terms for talks to begin. That is a pitch to the Chinese, saying basically that we need you to persuade Moscow to soften their position if there is to be any movement whatsoever from our position. And this is just for talks, bear in mind. We're not talking about concessions, we're talking about talks. Now, the conversation between the Chinese and the Ukrainians lasted over 3 hours in total, which is considerably longer than was planned. And a source told Reuters that it was a very deep and concrete conversation. Now, as I say, David, we need to be cautious of headlines that have come out of this, which lead with that line, Ukraine ready for talks, without understanding the context and nuance of the Ukrainian position. As I said yesterday, this is not, I don't think, a breakthrough as much as it is an opportunity for Kyiv to state directly its position, which is pretty unflinching, firmly at odds with Moscow's, that latterly wanting the total capitulation of Kyiv in terms of its sovereignty with quite major territorial concessions is still off the cards, and that Moscow needs to understand that if there is to be any possibility of conversations, of negotiations. It bears repeating, of course, that in that context, Kyiv is obliged to do this kind of stating of its position and saying that it is willing to have conversations due to limitations in terms of meaningful long-term Western assurances, especially from the United States. The fact is, though, that as we discussed last week, in Ukraine, the idea of negotiations and the possibility of concessions being the result thereof, while still very unpopular, is no longer a forbidden subject given the current context on the battlefield. Another poll, this time by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, has argued that a majority, 55%, remain opposed to making any territorial concessions for a quick end to the war. But 32% would agree to some for there to be a quick end to the war. Nevertheless, that some is very, very hard to define. It may mean Crimea and not an inch in other regions, for instance. So, as ever with polling, one has to be very, very careful when trying to read too much into what they are saying. I think the only firm conclusions one can draw from it are those that I've just given there. A majority of Ukrainians do not want to see any territorial concessions, if that's the price for negotiations. But it is no longer a conversation that is not being had about the idea of there potentially being some concessions in order for there to be a quick end, emphasise that word, quick end, to the war. So a bit of a complicated picture there, David, but I thought it was really important to break that down because some people will just see the headline today, Ukraine ready for talks, and think that that is actually the reality. And I think it's much, much more complicated than that. Now, returning to the events in the US, of course, equally as important at the moment, the US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin reaffirmed Washington's unwavering support for Ukraine in a call with Ukraine's defense minister, the Pentagon has announced last night. It was the first call between the defense heads since President Joe Biden stood down from running in the November election. He has, of course, endorsed Kamala Harris for the Democratic nomination. We understand that there was also a call in that context between Harris's national security advisor and Zelensky's chief of staff. They discussed the situation on the front line and the increasing number of Russian attacks on Ukrainian cities and community, especially on energy infrastructure. That's what the Presidential Office of Ukraine said in a statement, just a sign there of how power has already shifted away from Joe Biden in real time in terms of the conversations now taking place between foreign governments and the White House, the extended White House, the vice presidency. Now, turning to the European sphere next, EU ambassadors have supported today the transfer of 4.2 billion euros to Kyiv as the first regular payment under that Ukraine facility, that new entity created off the back of the 75th anniversary NATO summit. The Ukraine facility allocates 33 billion euros in loans and 17 billion euros in grants, conditional on the Ukrainian government carrying out certain reforms. Now, these funds will be directed towards Ukraine's recovery, reconstruction and modernisation. It's the one that was flagged last week as being the first instalment, but it has, as I say, been formally completed today. Now, here in Britain, the new Prime Minister Keir Starmer has just been giving his first Prime Minister's questions, that opportunity where questions are put to him from members of Parliament across the House of Commons. Just for our international leaders, it's this event where you quite often hear the Speaker crying out, "Order, order," which you can't really do when speaking quietly. You have to shout it out, hence my rather feeble attempt there. But it really matters. It's an opportunity to measure the strength of a Prime Minister's power in the House of Commons, as well as getting the sense of what the agenda of the day is, or for that week. And what was very interesting, which is why I mention it here, is that Ukraine was the first subject of discussion, with questions put to him by, first of all, former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. And Starmer reaffirmed his government's commitment to Ukraine and to expanding sanctions. No further details, but it speaks to how, as I say, Ukraine is still perhaps the major issue here in Britain, as it is in many other European capitals. Not so much, of course, in the United States at present. Now, I have some more thoughts on the British perspective, which we perhaps can come to later on. But just to wrap up this section, another story from Georgia after our update yesterday, with its state security service investigating a plot by former senior officials living in Ukraine to assassinating its ruling party leader. Ukraine's TASS news agency cited the service as saying on Wednesday it provided no further details, including the names of the suspects, but will be interpreted by some, of course, as yet another signal that Kyiv is in this government's sights. And finally, North Korea next. It's keen to bolster ties with Belarus to what it calls open a new era. That's coming from its state media, quoting its foreign minister today. The foreign minister met with Ruznikov, her Belarusian counterpart, in Pyongyang earlier on Tuesday. Russia, of course, agreed that landmark pact with North Korea last month that allows either country to provide the other with military assistance if faced with armed aggression. And this is just another example, I think, of this new axis, if one wants to call it that, formalising relationships which have been allowed to grow stronger the longer that the war in Ukraine has been allowed to continue. Another reason why it was, in many people's opinions, in the West's strategic interest to see the war in Ukraine ended as swiftly as possible, with a decisive blow to Moscow's military ambitions. Moscow's relationships with China, North Korea, Belarus, Iran, all have been strengthened as a consequence of this war being allowed to continue. And of course, that has major implications for all of us. But that's where we are in terms of the top line stories on politics, David.
Thank you very much, Francis. Would you then take us through some of your thoughts and reflections on the British position that you've been looking into today?
Yes, well, the Telegraph always prioritises getting the inside track on what the British Armed Forces are thinking, and especially debates internal and external about its future trajectory in the European context, as well as in the global Western context too. Now, yesterday, I talked in my final thought about the internal debate about this strategic review, which I won't repeat all of the context of here. But whether one is in favour of the timing of that review into the armed forces or not, it seems a very common view in the armed forces that things are far more serious, both in terms of the armed forces' strength and in terms of the strategic picture on the continent than many people realise, particularly politicians. Now, I say this because we've had two stories in print today, and we'll add links in the show notes too, from senior figures in the British Armed Forces saying various different things. So the first is Sir Tony Radakin, of course, who we've interviewed on the podcast, Chief of the Defence Staff. He said the British Army is not as strong as it could be, blaming historic underinvestment in defence. Then we have General Sir Rowley Walker, the new Chief of the General Staff. And he has said in his first major statement since assuming the role last month that Britain must be able to deter or fight a war in 3 years. He's warned that in the second half of this decade, Russia, China and Iran could unite to put the West under pressure and achieve their individual goals. Now, here's the interesting bit. He says there is a scenario whereby a very, very dangerous Russia emerges from Ukraine either defeated or as a victor, and China invades Taiwan and Iran becomes more aggressive. Then he says, and I quote, That is why you get to this point by 2027-28, this convergence may have reached some sort of mutual singularity, and your ability to deal with them in isolation, a specific crisis that can be managed by the rules-based system, I think becomes significantly diminished. A problem in one area is likely to trigger a sympathetic detonation in another, and therefore it is a global problem looked at from different perspectives around the world. Then he goes on, describing the potential threat in Europe. I think Russia will emerge from its war in Ukraine probably weaker objectively or absolutely, but still very, very dangerous and wanting some form of retribution for what we have done to help Ukraine. By any measure, they have lost hundreds of thousands of casualties, and if they carry on as they are, it's going to take them 5 years just to take the Donbas. So that's a hell of a price that they have paid, he says. And the lesson from history is that the Russians don't forget, and they will come back to get their revenge. So those are the remarks by major military figures here. I do find those remarks, of course, interesting, not least because they tally with the analysis from Eastern Europe at the moment, which would put Britain in that block of Eastern European countries in its level of hawkishness, one could argue, as opposed to, say, the French and the German position, which is less inclined to that position if the worst were to happen and Ukraine were to require emergency support and perhaps even more proactive measures in terms of support that Kyiv might require should the United States withdraw. I also think it's interesting as well for this general analysis that's being made here about either way, there is not going to be a continuation of the status quo at the end of this war. Again, that might differ from some countries' perspectives, at least to how they were seeing this at the very beginning of the war, which is they wanted to see an end to the war swiftly, whereby perhaps conversations could begin with Moscow and Putin. Again, that we might see some kind of restored relations, some kind of economic relations restored. The general figures here are saying, no, whatever happens, Russia will be strong-ish, and will be conducting its hybrid war and will be conducting a revenge platform. So, again, I think that's absolutely correct, by the way. But again, it states the British position as being very, very different from certain other Western powers, I think. Now, just on this idea that Russia will be stronger either way, I think that, of course, and I don't think, by the way, I'm in disagreement with what General Walker is saying here, that is in our hands, right? That is a something that we can still shape of how Russia approaches this war. I think we need to be very careful of interpreting his remarks as saying here this kind of Treaty of Versailles argument that Russia could be defeated and then become even stronger as a result. As we've said many other times on the podcast, the lesson of Versailles is not necessarily that countries will always come back stronger if you decisively defeat them. Rather, it is about the danger of not enacting policies that you've put in place. Versailles made very clear what the consequences for Germany would be of rearmament. The West, if I can use that term, just chose to ignore them. And we could choose to ignore them and thereby allow Moscow to become much stronger. So we need to avoid that interpretation, as I say, but nonetheless, a general picture emerging here, David, whether it be just seen in the London context or whether we see it in the Poland and Eastern Bloc country context within the Western Alliance at the moment, of a dangerous picture emerging indeed, where we need to be preparing, whatever now happens in Ukraine, for the potentiality for conflict within 3 years in order to prevent that conflict. This is about forming an effective deterrence. If we don't, the military figures, very senior military figures in NATO and in Britain and in other powers, are saying that we are heading to a very, very serious situation indeed that involves not just Ukraine, but other Western powers. So I thought it was worth there, David, for that reason, us having another section discussing it there today. Very, very interesting indeed.
Thank you, Francis. Recently, I spoke to Mathieu Boulegue, a freelance researcher and consulting fellow with the Russia and Eurasia programme at Chatham House in London. Mathieu is one of a team of authors who have produced a fascinating new report into the state of the Russian war machine. We'll put a link in the show notes. So, let's get into it. Well, today we're going to talk about your joint report assessing Russian plans for military regeneration, modernization and reconstitution challenges for Moscow's war machine. Obviously, lots of lessons and implications for the ongoing invasion of Ukraine. Can we just start with your broad analysis, your summary of where the Russian military is over 2 years into the full-scale invasion?
The first thing to start with is really to look at our own assumptions, the Western assumptions and NATO assumptions in and on themselves, of where we place and where we used to place the strength and the might of the Russian military. There was a moment, probably before the first call to action, a call to arms by the Russian army in 2008, when they tried to invade Georgia and took over two territories, breakaway territories from Georgia, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, where we really got the first sort of understanding of the abilities of the Russian forces and what they could actually achieve in certain types of war. Then the second jab came with the first invasion of Ukraine and the takeover, the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the subsequent diversionary war in Donbas. And then 2022 with the full scale of the attempt to invade Ukraine fully in 2022. So in a way, for the past 15 years now, we've had a clearer idea of what Russia can achieve or cannot achieve at war against a peer competitor or a near peer competitor or a sort of military inferior competitor or enemy. And I think we've been basing a lot of assumptions and we've been putting a lot of assumptions of what they can achieve according to our own understanding of what Russian warfare would look like against what they can actually achieve. And if there are different markers that we can look at, in Georgia, for instance, with the reforms that came right afterwards, in the first war against Ukraine, the second war against Ukraine, we are increasingly learning our lessons on what does actual Russian fighting power look like? What does actual deterrence against Russia look like, to make sure that we understand very finely what it is to fight against Russian forces and to try to push back against Russia's military might. And what, on the other end of the spectrum, what does Russian regeneration, reconstitution look like? These are very broad terms. It's a lot of, words, regeneration, reconstitution, recapitalization. But it basically means only one thing: the sustained and continued ability of Russian forces to wage war, not least against Ukraine right now, but also against wider Western interests moving forward. The Russian military and the Russian policy-making world, and Putin in particular, and the elite around him, define themselves in a state of conflict, if not war, against Western interests. God knows they're at war against Ukraine, but even more widely so, they are in a state of prolonged conflict against Western interests. And they are waging this conflict, this war, through different means. We used to call it hybrid. We used to call it gray zone in a way. I think we need to go a little bit further and to start calling it for what it is. It is a low-intensity conflict. Low intensity because we are in a form of warfare that is short of tanks, short of actual engagement or direct military confrontation. But it is very much a conflict in the sense that Russia is increasingly defining itself in a form of war. A war of ideas, a war of civilization, a war of domination of the system, a war of trying to bring us down, take us down, and weaken us from within, limit our ability to push back, to deter, and to prevail against an aggressive Kremlin. So overall, where we are now, almost 3 years after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, is a very mixed picture, where we have seen, in a way, both of the worst and the best of what Russia can offer in a wider scale conflict. A very unique conflict as well, because we have now the largest proportion of trench warfare in the world. We have now the largest proportion of shells and artillery and mortar fire ever employed by mankind throughout human history. And in a scale that is unprecedented. We are really talking about an old war, quote unquote, what Mary Kaldor, the famous researcher, defined as an old war, a dirty war, if you wish, a war of tanks, a war of terror, a war of attrition, all these terms that we can read and we can see, which is very much defining where we are now in this conflict. Contrary to the more modern wars, the wars that are intermeshed within society, urban warfare, different forms of warfare or low-intensity conflict that we see elsewhere or we see by proxy between great forces and great powers. We have the complete opposite today. We have a form of old war, a dirty war that will still poison European security and the very survival of Ukraine for the decades to come.
So in terms of regeneration of the forces fighting in this war, what's your assessment of Russia's ability so far to do this? I mean, it's interesting you say this is a dirty war, so you're talking tanks, men, ammunition, not necessarily the sort of more high-tech stuff as well, but you tell us.
So I'd like to take the audience back to early discussions after the first phases of the full-scale invasion. Very quickly in the general public, in the press, even in expert discussion, if the audience will remember, we were reading a lot that Russia will run out of missiles, Russia will run out of ammo, Russia will run out of this. They will no longer be able to do that. Well, almost 3 years onwards, we still have an aggressive and vindictive Russia that can still throw stuff at Ukraine and gain territory on the ground and being able to push against Ukrainian defenses on the ground. So I'd like to put that sort of logic into consideration, that it's not so much that the Russian armed forces are continuously reconstituting their military power. They're also using the stock and using existing stockpiles of weapons, ammo, hardware systems, you name it, and being more efficient at it. And this is also something that we are learning in the global community, is the extent and the amount of said stockpile. The end of the Cold War was already a first jab at looting that stockpile, when we had a lot of former Soviet military equipment we could find pretty much on every theater of operation in the world. Africa, Afghanistan, Asia, Middle East in general, we could find Russian Kalashnikov, I think, which is the largest symbol of Soviet warfare everywhere in the world. But that stockpile never depleted. And Russia is able to work on two different settings, which is creating new gear and making sure its military industry is still able to produce low-tech, highly efficient warfare equipment to fight against Ukraine, but also rationalize the use of its stockpile, which in certain aspects is nearly unlimited when it comes to spare parts, when it comes to bullets, when it comes to ammunition, when it comes to even more low-tech warfare. They are still able to make do with, in a way. And this is why I was discussing this approach of an old war. Russian systems don't need to be great. They don't need to be technologically advanced. They don't need to be Star Wars sci-fi. They just need to work. And this is the very logic of the Russian armed forces, is what I argue to be good enough. It just needs to be good enough. This is the opposite of the Western approach to warfare. We need dominance in terms of technology, in terms of systems. We need to have the most skillful personnel trained on the most advanced forms of platform and military technology. Russia has a completely different approach to it. They just throw stuff just because they have them. And as long as it works, right? Because in front of them, they have an opponent, Ukraine, who is equally in dire straits when it comes to its own position on the battlefield, highly dependent on Western military assistance, in a complicated situation when it comes to actual fighting power, fighting an increasingly defensive war where they have to sustain the onslaught of Russian forces with that sort of nearly unlimited potential with military capabilities and hardware. So it is very much where we are, I think, in terms of that reconstitution, the ability of Russia to keep throwing things at Ukraine from a low-tech perspective in many ways, specifically in terms of ground warfare.
What's been the impact in your assessment of Western sanctions on that ability to reconstitute high-tech and low-tech?
So when it comes to sanctions, it's interesting to see that Russia has been adapting fairly well to the different sanctions regime that have been imposed against the Russian leadership, different sectors of the Russian industry, different sectors of Russian economics, specifically against the military industry and beyond, for over a decade now, with the first sanctions in 2014. So they have got used to it, in a way. They have got used to living under sanctions. Of course, sanctions have had a tremendous impact on the ability of Russia to buy and access Western technology off the shelf, to access directly Western-based military technology, to further the more high-tech hardware in Russia. But when it comes to the low-tech stuff, the things that can easily retrofit and place into the Russian armed forces and use them on the battlefield, I must say that this is a big failure. I don't think there are any other words than to say that the sanctions regime, if it could achieve more, has not been able to achieve much more than this. Russia and the Russian leadership have found very innovative ways to adapting to the sanctions regime when it comes to imports, when it comes to buying off the shelf different parts, microelectronic components, for instance, different hardware as well, different pieces of equipment, ammo, you name it. We've seen it, for instance, if the audience is aware of it, with North Korea, for instance, this Orient Express, as it was dubbed by colleagues from RUSI in the UK, where we have seen increased volume of exports from North Korea to Russia when it comes to ammunition, for instance, or certain weapon systems. So it really is about the friends Russia keeps. It really is about the sort of allies the Kremlin still has, giving it and enabling it access to third-party imports to further the military machine and continue feeding the military machine as they go along.
Was this innovation of the Russian elites, the Russian military's ability to find friends and make friends that would supply them with what they needed, was that anticipated, do you think, by analysts? Or is that something that's come as a bit of a surprise, their ability to find what they need around the world?
It was a surprise in 2014 with the first sanctions, definitely, where the first reaction of the Russian military was to burn through existing stocks and stockpiles of components, for instance, spare parts, replacement parts, microelectronics, you name it, they had in their sort of bag of available components and assets. They burned through the stocks because they didn't have a lot of alternative. What happened after is that they very quickly went into two different programs. The first program was what they called import substitution, which is code for trying to produce at home what they used to import from the global West and global community. And the second leg of that strategy was really to reach out to third-party importers and try to fill that void of off-the-shelf systems or components, you name it. And they reached out to the friends they had back in the day, China, India, Pakistan, North Korea more recently, Iran, of course, as we've seen it with the drones, for instance. So this has been a big part of the strategy to adapt. And for the past 10 years, they have made great success in a way. They have achieved forms of success, if we can talk about success in furthering the war and furthering the military machine. It is a sort of stapler for Russia's ability to continue with the war and to keep a close circle of friends that have absolutely no problem and no worries furthering that war, bypassing and circumventing sanctions, that have absolutely no moral issue with siding with Putin pretty much overtly when it comes to certain countries.
Earlier, you mentioned Ukraine's dependency on the West for a lot of its equipment and its ability to prosecute the war. And what you've just described is a certain dependency of Russia on its own allies. I mean, how dependent is Russia on these allies, would you say? And could that potentially be a problem in the future if you're absolutely relying on autocratic regimes to prop you up?
So it is very much a dependency that is critical. What Russia has done for the past 10 years is replace Western dependency by another form of third-party dependency with other allies. I would argue that Russia will always find forms of allies and countries that are willing and are able to help Russia prosecute the war and continue furthering the military machine and the military industry in Russia. That's A. And B, in a way, Russia does, if they are to an extent and at some point in history in the coming months or years, they are devoid of these relationships, or they are blocked because we will have smarter sanctions, better sanctions, or more enforced sanctions on certain parts of the military industry, they will always make do. They will always get by. Because once again, things don't need to be great, they just need to be good enough. And if there is one thing with the Russian military industry and all these networks of corruption, all these illegal and black market networks that they have put together, is the ability to sustain them, to work beyond the accepted logic of actual contracts, to work in the shadows, to work through the mafia, to work through illegal networks and black market networks with third-party countries. So it is very much a stapler of resilience. And it is very much a display of adaptation that the Russian military has been showing. So yes, it is a form of dependency against third-party imports, But I would argue they will always make do. They will always be able to field and produce good enough systems and keep prosecuting the war against Ukraine.
Looking at the military in a more granular sense then, how have the ground forces in particular changed during the full-scale invasion? Obviously they've lost so many men, so much equipment, and that's being replaced. But how has that replacement and how has the way that is being replaced changed the organisation and changed the units that are going on to fight the war?
I won't have the latest details because I'm not really following exactly, the sort of day-to-day developments in the ground forces. But what we've seen is several cycles of adaptation. When in the first phases of the war, when Russia started the sort of full-scale invasion, Russia initially threw everything they could along different strategic directions against Ukraine. They've opened different operational fronts in the south, in the east with Donbas, also trying to move north with this failed takeover of Kiev when they were doing that standoff against Kiev and that siege against Kiev from the north, to then understand that they could not and were not able to sustain such a wide geography and such a wide war effort throughout the ground forces. Russia decided then to refocus on its strength, which is limited ground-based assaults with long-range strikes and the ability to strike in depth against Ukrainian defenses, mostly in Donbas and also in the south, creating different waves and movements of attacks, counterattacks, offensives, counteroffensives between the different parts of the war front, and being able to very quickly and very smartly move from one position to the other between Donbas and the south, from occupied Crimea, to try to move more deeply into Ukrainian territory and create these different waves of offensives and counteroffensives. So the ground forces have adapted. They have been able to quickly, for instance, repair military equipment directly on the battlefield instead of having to send them much farther away into defensive lines for repair. They've been able to adapt the command and control as well to be more flexible and to have less operational loss on the ground after the first months of the war, where Russia had tremendous losses and had to leave a lot of not just fighting power, humans on the ground, but also a lot of equipment that they left on the field. They've been able to be more flexible in their approach and to position themselves much better. And I think the term position is very important because we have now, as I was mentioning, the largest proportion of trenches in the history of humankind. It is very much a war of position. Yes, the audience will read here and there that Russia is gaining territory here, is also retrenching at some places because Ukrainians are managing to also free up some pieces of their territory bit by bit. But it's mostly a war of position. It is mostly a war of attrition where one party is forcing the other to basically stop on both sides because they are no longer able to push militarily from a strategic perspective to completely flatten these trenches, flatten these line of defenses and push deeply into the territory. You have tactical advances, you have tactical movements, you have battles taking place, but wars are won through different battles and different victories in battles. Right now, we have a sort of standoff. We have a very mixed position where Ukraine and Russia are winning battles here and there, regaining and relosing territory here and there. But no party at this stage, at this very given moment right now, is able to push strategically with the ability to completely change the maps on the ground. And this is where we are. And this is why all these things are taking such a long time when it comes, and we've been reading about, waves of offensive, waves of counteroffensive, the famous, summer offensive here or the winter counteroffensive there. These things take a lot of time to prepare. And I will also remind the audience that when we talk about an offensive or a counteroffensive, they are never as spectacular or as magic, if you will, as we want. It always takes time. A counteroffensive here or an offensive there will not completely change the maps on the ground. They will not completely change the face of a war, especially given the input that we have on both sides from Russia and Ukraine, recalling this high level of attrition that we have at the moment. So we need to be, in a way, patient with Ukraine when there have been a lot of discussions on their ability to continue prosecuting the war, with their ability to push back against the invader and free up more territory, these things take time. These things are extremely hard to achieve, and it's not like they are going to be able to burst through hundreds of kilometers and free up their invaded territory and their occupied territory next week, for instance.
One of the more eyebrow-raising personnel changes in Russia in the last few months was, of course, the replacement of Sergei Shoigu's defense minister by Andrei Belousov. Could you just give us your thoughts on that replacement and just what that might show us strategically about what the Russian high command, the leadership is thinking about what it needs to win this war?
Yeah, absolutely. So I will caveat the sort of strategic approach because Russia's grand strategy has not changed. And it will not change. And I will very sadly remind the audience that Putin's grand strategy and Russia's grand strategy at this stage is to destroy, collapse, and break Ukraine as a sovereign nation. That goal has not changed. The Russian leadership, and Putin in particular, and everyone prosecuting the war in Russia will not stop until and unless Ukraine is destroyed as a sovereign nation. This is where we are now. This is something that has been understood and is very clear and will not change in Russian grand strategy of things. What has changed, for instance, through adaptations in the war, or what has changed in terms of the power networks and how Russia prosecutes the war with these power changes, for instance, with the new military leadership and the constant shuffle of military leadership, is not the grand strategy. It really is the tactical adaptations to respond to that grand strategy with, once again, the constant and adamant goal that the Russian leadership has to destroy Ukraine, to conquer the whole of Ukraine and make it disappear as a sovereign nation. The tactical changes we've seen, and I'm glad you didn't use the term purge, because we read it probably many times that it was a purge inside the Ministry of Defense and so on. It is not a purge. A purge would have been the complete removal, the sort of terraforming of the MOD and the security forces, and the complete replacement with another bunch of yes people responding to sort of Putin vertical of power. What we have is tactical adaptations, because there is a clear understanding, I think, in the Kremlin that wars are not just won with weapons and people, they're also won with money. And placing Mr. Belousov as head of the Ministry of Defense, a technocrat with a finance background, is the best approach that the Kremlin has to rationalize the war effort. It only means one thing: less money available and less resources available for the Russian population, more resources available for the war. The corollary for Ukraine, and the very tragic consequence, is that the war will continue, the war will worsen for Ukraine, and things will continue even worse, and the war will get more traction throughout the Russian ministries, throughout the power networks and the elites, and will require more from the Russian population, because they will need to sacrifice more of their own resources to continue prosecuting that war. So as long as that social contract holds in Russia, and the Russian population is not criticizing or rebelling against the war, things will change. But that movement, that change in the different power networks, is only a tactical move. It is not necessarily a sign that Minister Shoigu, for instance, has been disavowed, because he still has a very nice golden retirement plan and will still be influential in the Russian system. It is just the understanding that wars is not just tanks, it's not just cannon fodder, it is also money. Money, money, money. It really is about the money.
I think that leads nicely to the next question. Over the past 2 years, we've been looking at Russian tactical and strategic adaptation to setbacks, to successes, etc. And there's been a discussion about to what extent the military forces are a learning organisation, but also how that learning is actually done. And I'd just be interested in your thoughts on that. I mean, it seems from everything you're saying that I think we can look at the Russian army and say, yes, it's a learning organisation. You know, these people do want to win, they don't want to die, and to do that, they'll have to learn. But I'd be interested as well, how has that process happened over the past 2.5 years?
So it's a very interesting question, because if we take the example of armies in our own communities, in NATO, for instance, in the United Kingdom, or in Europe, the United States, armies evolve, right? Organizations evolve organically through incremental changes, but also breakthrough changes, with the ability of an army corps to completely rethink its own purpose and mission and propel it into modernity, right? And we've seen it with different waves of military evolution in the US, for instance, in contact with actual warfare, in Iraq and Afghanistan. We've seen it done by various armies. In Russia, it is, I think, a very mixed track record, not least because of the very nature of the Russian armed forces and the very inheritance they have from the Soviet past, and the very sclerotic, very hierarchical, vertical of power approach to military modernization and to military leadership. We have seen tactical adaptations and the ability of the Russian forces to alter their own doctrine, to change their approach to command and control, for instance, to military communication, to their ability to conduct operations on the ground. We've seen it in Syria, for instance, more specifically when the sort of modern command and control was tested after 2015, and further to 2022 with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. What we haven't seen yet is the ability of the Russian military to fully adapt and evolve from the top down, having a sort of complete overhaul of how they approach territory, geography, military thinking, doctrine, and so on. Some would argue because they don't need to, because things are working best way they can with regards to Ukraine, for instance, and with regards territorial organization. We have seen some changes take place, for instance, with the creation of 2 new military districts this year. The Moscow military district, which will be exclusively in charge of operations against Ukraine and security of Kaliningrad and Baltic Sea approaches, and the Leningrad military district, which will take over mostly high north and Arctic operations. So these are more tactical operational adaptations. They are not big strategic changes that will help the Russian forces propel itself into modernity or rethink completely its approach to warfare. And this is the very question that we need to ask ourselves. Is the Russian army a learning organization? Yes, to an extent, from a tactical perspective. From a more sort of holistic top-down logic or strategic approach, I don't know yet. I don't have the answer, not least because maybe Russian military thinkers believe they don't need to. But if they did believe so, then what would they be able to do? We've seen some tremendous adaptations since 2008, since the war against Georgia. We've seen adaptations since 2014 in the first invasion of Ukraine. But the very nature of the system remains. This constant interplay between professional soldiers and kontrakniki, contractors, that they have to hire. This constant struggle within the military to procure modern equipment, right? With this good enough logic I was mentioning, that things don't need to be great, they just need to be good enough. The problem is that you do not fight modern warfare with good enough systems. You cannot be just good enough in space. You cannot be just good enough in quantum computing, in human enhancements, in electronic warfare. You need to be good. And this is where Russia will have a problem moving forward, is that to continue facing peer competitors, and I'm thinking specifically about NATO forces, but also increasingly China, you can't just be good enough. You need to be great. You need to be the best, right? That's where the Soviet Union used to be for space operations, for instance, for missile systems and strategic deterrence, for instance. Today, the Russian forces and the Russian military in general do not have that ability to sustain competition at the same pace as its competitors from a pure technological perspective. And this is where we also need to think about ways to deter the Kremlin moving forward.
Well, before we draw all of your thoughts together, can I ask, obviously you've been looking at the Russian forces and Russian strategy for a long time, and for this paper, for the full-scale war, more than 2 years. Are there any myths, misunderstandings that people often get wrong about Russia's war that you think are important to mention, that you'd want our listeners to be aware of as well?
That's a good question. I think there will always be misunderstandings at war, not least because we have 2 ways to see this very war and the very nature of this war. That Ukraine is fighting for its own existence, fighting for its own survival, or the way that the Trump presidency candidates, for instance, are seeing the war, which is we can't be bothered with Ukraine. Right? And that it doesn't really matter what's happening in Ukraine. You have 2 ways of seeing it. I think the most common misunderstanding and misconception we may have is that this is our watershed moment for the global community. This is it, guys. In the sense that if we do not side with Ukraine, if we do not help Ukraine win this war, and by winning I mean making sure Ukraine is a fully sovereign territory with no Russian troops and complete sovereignty over its integral internationally recognized border prior to 2014, which includes Crimea, we will stand to lose everything in the global system, because we will let our enemies get away with murder. We will let our enemies get away with the thinking and the belief that destroying a country, breaking a population, and invading a fallen sovereign territory is okay. That gives a lot of bad examples to a lot of bad guys in the world that this is fine. And that's the very morality, the very cement of the international community based on rules, on the law, on respect, can be broken, can be destroyed, can be trampled. And it's not that it's trampled, it's more that people can get away with it. So I think this is the most common misunderstanding. And it is, yes, a very hard endeavor. It takes tremendous effort. It takes sacrifice from each and every one of us, because the question always comes back. It probably is coming to the mind of the audience as well. Why should my country, whether it's the UK or Spain or France, spend more military assistance to Ukraine when life is getting harder? Prices are increasing because there is inflation and so on. Absolutely, why should we? But if we don't do it, things are going to get even harder, because there will be increased competition in the world. We will give all the wrong ideas to all the wrong people that it's okay to break the system. And the moment this system is broken, a international order based on respect, on law, on order, things will get messy. The system is not perfect, of course. It is far from perfect. Rules are broken all the time. But the opposite, I'd like to project the audience into what the opposite of the world will look like. A world where we have constant wars for resources, for access, constant population displacement, because people will be lacking even more and missing even more opportunity than today. That is not the answer. That is not the solution. It's even worse. Fighting for Ukraine and standing with Ukraine is the only thing we need to do to make sure the system survives. If it doesn't survive, things will get worse for us. Our everyday livelihood will be even worse than it is today. So that's why we absolutely need to focus our efforts and attention on helping Ukraine as much as possible until the end, which is our own strategy, right? Russia has a very clear strategy. Our strategy should be the complete defeat of Russian forces, the removal of said Russian forces from sovereign Ukraine territory, and a wide, very large-ranging discussion on the future of Russia in the world and in the European security architecture, more specifically. The Kremlin leadership will need to be punished, and we will need to find solutions and options to deter Russia inside that European security architecture. Not to integrate it, of course, because we cannot integrate what are now war criminals and warmongers, but to make sure we can encapsulate them into that European security order, into that worldwide security order, and make sure they do not cause more harm than they are already doing it. And I will stop on this, is that if we don't stop Putin now, and if we don't stop this war from a positive outcome for Ukraine and the global community, the Kremlin will come back. And that takes us back to our discussion on military reconstitution and rejuvenation of military forces, is that if we give the opportunity of the Russian leadership to take stock of what they've lost, recapitalize, regenerate all their hardware and people, they will come back for a third invasion. Whether it is in 6 months, whether it is in 10 years, this will not change overnight. That strategy will remain. Even more so because it will probably also remain post-Putin. It is not just a Putin thing. There is no guarantee that after Putin is removed or dies in power, that this will not continue, and that Ukraine will still not suffer the brunt of Russia's grand strategy. Right now, there are no signs whatsoever that the war would abate in a post-Putin environment. So this is also another no-brainer for us to continue helping Ukraine and standing with Ukraine and behind Ukraine, is that the Kremlin will come back. Any given moment, if we give them the opportunity, they will come back.
Thank you very much for your time.
With pleasure. It was great to be here.
Thank you so much, Mathieu. Just a reminder to listeners that we'll put a link to the full report in the show notes. For now, let's go to our final thoughts. I will go first with our final thoughts. Just to take us back to two things, a conversation that I had with Dom and a conversation I had with Roland, obviously a guest on this podcast that listeners will be very familiar with. For months and months, maybe, I mean, we could even say now years, really, when we talk about Russian advances, we usually are talking in terms of incremental small steps, 100 metres here, 100 metres there, a sudden quick push through, in a village over there, that kind of thing. And it's sometimes, I think, rather not easy, but we can say, you can zoom out of the map and you can see that really the lines aren't changing that much. That is true. That's unarguable. Now, let's relay what I spoke with Roland about. So a couple of days ago, I was just going up and down Deep State's map to try and understand, where is the front line now? How is it moving? And you notice that the salient that we've been talking about close to Ocheretinie, so that's northwest of Avdiivka, I'm looking at it now, where the Russians are pushing towards this really important logistics highway between Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka. And you've got Donetsk to the southeast, sort of beneath Konstantinivka there. They're rather close to this highway. Looked at it, as the crow flies, it's around 5, 6, 7 kilometres. And this all adds up. And this is what Roland said. He said, well, if you go 100 metres a day, 200 metres, 300 metres a day, then fast forward 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 2 months, 3 months, you do make up some ground, even if when you zoom out on the map, it doesn't seem so significant. And so that's just something to bear in mind, that when you look at the map now, you've got several pressure points which the Ukrainians are rather worried about. If you go to the east, you can look at the attack on Chasiv Yar. And the Russians are just over the canal to the east of the city. To the south in Donbas, you've got Russians taking, according to Deep State anyway, they're on the point of enveloping the whole of the settlement of New York to the west of Horlivka. If you look to the west, where we were focusing on today, you've got this mini encirclement to the northeast of Prohores and south of several other villages. That place is south of the closest point at which Russian forces are to the crucial highway. And again, if you look south again, as I'm doing now, the Russians are advancing on the other side of the lake opposite Kharlivka. And it's just quite a few important advances, small daily though they may be, which when you sort of zoom out and look at it over 3-4 months, do add up and do change the strategic picture. Again, I'm just clicking north to Chasiv Yar, so slightly northeast of Konstantinivka, and again, you've got these small advances up to the river, up to the canals, all of which matter, and the Ukrainian armed forces are being put under quite a lot of pressure in all these different places simultaneously, and does it change the strategic picture? Well, it does, but slowly. And it's one of those things where every few months we do have to come back to, I think, and just reassess and reappraise what we're looking at. And I think that the torrent of updates we started today's episode with hopefully started to do that. As I said, there's a heavy pinch of salt to be taken with lots of this. Things are ongoing. Things may change. But the strategic picture is looking more dangerous in Donbas than it certainly was. I think that's unarguable. And what worries me, what worries I think many analysts looking at this, is just the number of different pressure points. Just to recap, Chasiv Yar in the northeast, Donetsk, New York, the villages we were talking about now close to the highway, south again near Krasnoyarivka. These all matter and these all add up. I'm sorry, Francis, I hadn't really come to a conclusion there. I noticed my own, how that shifted my own appreciation of what we think is maybe happening in Donbas in the east. But Francis, would you like to finish today's episode? What have you been looking at?
Well, thanks, David. It's really interesting hearing those reflections. And as I say, for listeners who are interested in this, there's going to be this piece that Roland's going to be looking about assessing the summer offensive, which I think will help contextualise this yet further. I think also as well, it just shows the danger of this term that's still hearing banded around every now and then, stalemate. Because yes, as you say, there are incremental gains or incremental losses, which can give the illusion of stalemate. But that term is very problematic because Russia is making gains that don't necessarily yet change the overarching strategic picture, but they are still making gains. And of course, it bears repeating just to try and inject, moving away from the abstract, people are dying in enormous numbers, Russians and Ukrainians. And so this idea of stalemate, I think it creates this sort of idea of First World War, nobody's doing anything, it's just static. Every day, the casualty numbers are enormous. And so we just need to be very cautious, I think, of how we look at the evolving picture at the moment. I don't think, as I say, my own perspective at the moment is that we can expect there to be a major breakthrough by Russia. And I don't think that the the very worst case scenarios, if we're thinking back 3 or 4 months ago, are likely to happen in that regard. But that is a very different question from very, very worst case scenario to still a bad scenario. And so I emphasise that. I don't want to give the impression that things are good when I say that. I'm just talking about the very, very worst scenario being avoided. Now, my final thought, David, is just very, very brief indeed, which is I know we have very many university students who listen to our podcast around the world. And, of course, are also very interested in following our journalism, whether it be yours, mine, Dom's, Roland's, Joe's, the whole team. And just been asked to flag with you all that university students can actually now get free access, completely free access to the Telegraph's coverage, not only of Ukraine, but everything that we do, including our international coverage. We'll have a link in the show notes. I'll give you the sort of short version now, so just give me a moment. So it's www.telegraph.co.uk/customer/subscribe/students. And if you go on that, this should be good for anybody around the world, as long as you've got a .edu email address or a .ac.uk, you should be fine to get that. You don't have to do that annoying thing where you have to put in your credit card details. That should be enough, and you'll have completely free access. I think this is part of our attempt to connect with a wider international group of subscribers and listeners and readers. And so it's our gift to you, as it were, that if you're interested in following our coverage in more detail, further to just our audio offering, then you can do that by following that link. But as I say, we'll have a link in the show notes too. And thank you to all of you who are students who go beyond your studies and listen to us, because, of course, we do very much welcome that, and indeed your insights as well. I know I engage with many of you on Twitter. So thank you all very much. This one's for you.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our world affairs newsletter which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Giles Gear, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.